looks like we're mostly settled here, and I think I saw Stan's got our prayer to open us.
Mighty God, Heavenly Father, we give you Lord thanks for the day, for the beauty of it, and numerous blessings which you bestow upon us on a daily basis. Thank you, Father, we're able to gather together here to study your word tonight. Pray, Father, that we would enter into this study willing to learn and apply it to our lives. That you be with those not able to be here due to illness, those that are going to procedure. Pray, Father, that you would bless them and allow them to be healed and get this according to your will. You would watch over us now, forgive us our sins. Found faithful in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Okay, we are going to pick up on page 4 of the handout. The goal is that we're going to finish this handout tonight. If we've got a little bit to do on Sunday, that's okay. But I have our next handout on the back table for you. And that is fact number 1 that we're going to be looking at. And fact number 1 is going to be discussing the bedrock fact that Jesus is real. So that's what we'll start talking about on Sunday. Just to recap what we talked about, so we're all at the same spot. So we just started discussing what our approach is going to be in the class, how we're going to go about some of this. So we talked about, to start off, the thorny subject of what the nature of proof is. What do we mean when we're saying that we're trying to prove something? And that what we're not doing is, what we are not trying to do is say that this is, 100% something that you can absolutely prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, and everyone who doesn't believe it is stupid. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is showing the believability of it, the fact that these are things that we can be confident of, that strengthen and undergird our belief. And then we talked about some of these questions of, do we need to prove the resurrection to believe it? How did the disciples deal with the first claims about Jesus being raised? What about investigating questions surrounding faith, like resurrection or the reliability of the Bible? Can I truly believe if I don't know all the facts? And so there was a lot of important things that we talked about. But we said very simply, no, you don't have to be able to prove the resurrection historically to believe it. We all, as we said on Sunday, we're all here because we believe it. And how many of us have really dove into a deep study of this before? And so what we're doing is trying to supplement and strengthen our faith to show just how sure this bedrock of our faith is. And not to say that it needs to be replaced by any of this. And what we're doing is, we're undergirding, we're strengthening, we're going deeper into what we believe. And you can still be genuine and fervent and completely convicted in your belief, even if you don't know all this stuff. I would say on the flip side, I do think you should know this stuff, and I think you're all capable of knowing it. But you don't have to understand this in order to believe that Jesus is Lord and Christ. And then we talked about this idea of the bedrock or minimal facts approach. At the bottom of page 3 is where we introduced that. And this is basically, there's been a few books written that attempt to just say, okay, what is the core information that anybody who's spent time studying this subject would agree on? And when we mean anybody, we're talking about someone who is a believer in Jesus, someone who's undecided, or someone who is an atheist and doesn't even believe that God exists. What would all of them agree upon? And the goal is then to establish the bare minimum, or you could also, this is a sort of a loaded term, the lowest common denominator for those of you that like math, which I'm sure is everyone. What is the base, the core, the foundation that everyone agrees upon? And we talked about the the strength of these kind of approaches. And so we're going to pick up, because I want to just make a couple comments about number 1 and 2 on page 4. So this is where we're going to pick up. So some of the benefits of starting with this, as we said, it's clear and it's rational. We're not getting distracted with other things. We're getting right to the heart of the gospel. And this is what we should be trying to do. And if I can find my notes of what I wanted to say. Of the making of books, there is no end. And there's no end to these notes either. So what we're attempting to do here is look at what virtually anybody would agree on. And I am combining, I think, two complementary sort of approaches from this because I think they work well together. And so instead of being sidetracked by other topics or arguments about, for instance, what about the God of the Old Testament? Or is the Bible even reliable? Or what about archaeology supposedly disproving this or disproving that? Those are all really distractions from the main point. And the main thing that we all have to come to terms with, and what anybody who's evaluating the Christian faith needs to come to terms with, is who is Jesus? Is he who he said he was? Did he actually rise from the dead? And so this gets right to the heart and investigates the fundamental points of the Christian faith, which are Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And once we have those established, the rest of that stuff either sort of vanishes as unimportant or falls into place along with that. And that's one of the reasons I think this is so powerful. And this is also, I think, the best way to approach this evangelistically. Not getting taken here and taken there and distracted with all the things. We can talk about other questions, of course, and people are at different spots, but ultimately it all has to get brought back here. Was Jesus really the Son of God? Did he raise from the dead? Are those things true? And then I just want to say one thing about this idea on 2b. How does considering this help ground our belief? So we said what we're doing, it does not depend on whether the Bible is inspired or not. I do believe the Bible is inspired. But what we're looking at is information that you can believe and accept even if you don't think the Bible is inspired. And I would say if this information is true, then that has big implications for questions like that. And other things may be questionable or arguable, whatever you want to bring in, but establishing the bedrock of the gospel keeps us focused on the main things. It looks at the foundation of what our faith is built on. It centers our hope on those main things. So say, for instance, in the future sometime, some archaeological thing comes to light and says, oh, this definitely disproves this part of the Old Testament. Is our faith in Jesus Christ shaken as a result of that? No. Now that's just a hypothetical, of course. But this is centering and anchoring us. So even if other things are proven to be false or unreliable, we still have the heart of the gospel, and it's still reliable and believable. So what we're doing is strengthening and solidifying our faith here. Okay. So we're going to pick up with this idea of our source on page 4. And I will say at the outset that there are some complicated things in what we're talking about here, because what we're doing is we're doing some history, looking at the Bible historically, and we're looking at where we're getting our information from. And the difficulty with it is that I have found that I'm not always able to explain it the best. So if you do not understand something that we're talking about tonight, I really want you to ask me about it, because this is foundational to the rest of the class of why we're talking about this. The problem is not you. The problem is probably me in my communication of it. But we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 8. So turn there in your Bibles. And essentially, this is what we're going to spend the rest of tonight talking about. And really, in some ways, this is what we're going to spend the rest of the class talking about, is information from this. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 8. this is where we're going to get our information from here. This is what the class will be based on, what Paul wrote. If you read ahead and you did your homework, you know a little bit of why, and we're going to flesh some of that out. Can I get a volunteer to read 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 8? Addie.
Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and to the 12. And he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. Last of all, also to one untimely born, he appeared also to me.
Okay, thank you, Addie. So, in reading this, sure, we understand that this is saying a lot of important things, but unless we really dig into this passage, I don't think a lot of us realize how amazing what we have right here is. And so I want us to realize how important and amazing this is right here. And we're going to center our class around this material. And I said a couple things starting on the bottom of 4 as to why I'm doing this. So I want to center our class around this material that the apostle wrote, because as we're going to talk about, it's a nugget of some of the earliest Christian teaching that shows what the earliest followers of Jesus were believing and proclaiming. And as a, what do they call it? Spoiler alert. As a spoiler alert, this is possibly the very earliest teaching in all of the New Testament. And we're going to look at why that is. And secondly, at the top of 5 there, if you have a spot to go back and to see, okay, this is where we got everything from and this is where we started, it's a lot easier to remember what we're talking about. And so it'll make it easier to remember the class material if you can go back and read 1 Corinthians 1 through 8, 15, 1 through 8, and see, okay, we talked about this and we talked about this and we talked about this. And so it makes it easier to remember. But then also, why we're doing this is because it relies on the wisdom of the inspired apostle Paul and not on me or you or anybody else. But this is something that God spoke through someone, and that is the wisdom that I want to stand on, not mine or anyone else's. And so we can see just the depth of what God moved Paul to write here, and we can come to trust in what God said. And so those are all really important reasons of why we're talking about 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. And I am sorry because I'm going to do a little bit more lecturing tonight, which I don't like to do. But there's just information that I'm not expecting you to know or have access to, which is why I put it in the packet and which is why I'm talking about it. So let's look at this on page 5, the importance of 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. So that section starting on page 5. So in some ways, like I said, this whole class is just kind of an exposition of what Paul is talking about here and then linking it to history. And we're looking at what Paul says is the foundation of Christianity. So first, we need to establish why this material is so important and helpful. And to do that, we have to do a little bit of history and interpreting 1 Corinthians 15 in these verses right here. So number 1 on page 5, what does it mean that Paul delivered to the Corinthians what he also received in verse 3? What did we say there? What does it mean that Paul delivered to the Corinthians what he also received? Courtney.
Well, now I'm nervous because nobody else knows the answer.
No, go ahead.
So I just put that he delivered the message, so everything that Christ showed him, he was able to relay to everybody in the first person.
Okay, so he relayed the things that he had learned, some of it specifically from Jesus? Is what you're talking about? Right. Did we say anything else too? So Paul is, relaying this information that he knew to them. What else might we say here? Joy.
In addition to that, what he saw, what Paul saw, what he experienced, and what was predicted.
What was predicted, right? And that's an important thing because, as we said, this did not happen randomly. This had all been predicted for thousands of years. Okay. Anyone want to add to that? Andrew?
Because he's passing on what he's received, he's saying that he didn't editorialize and he didn't originate any part of it. He is merely transferring in its original form what he received is the same thing that he's telling them.
Yeah. And that's kind of a combination of what they were talking about. So depending on your version, delivered, I don't remember what some of these other ones have, but it's literally the idea of handing something over, handing it down. And this is really important. So let's look at 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. Let's look at some of the details here. So we see first, Paul reminds the believers of what he first preached to them in the gospel. And so in verse 1 and 2, he says, I'm reminding you here of what I originally preached to you. And let's look at some of that wording in verses 1 and 2. I make known to you, or I'm reminding you, the gospel which I preached to you, which you received. This is what they received back at the beginning. In which also you stand, by which also you are saved. So this information is what was preached to them, what they are being saved through, if you hold fast the word which I preached to you. So this is what you need to stay in, and what you received, and this is what you are being saved through. And then we get to verse 3. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. What does it mean that he delivered it to them as of first importance? Some of your versions might say that a little differently. Grace, what do you think that means?
If something's of first importance, then it's especially being prioritized in the things that he's teaching, and therefore ought to be especially prioritized in what we hear and what we're considering with regard to Scripture. So,
Yeah, this is what I said. The most important. This is what I gave you. This is what was most important. This is the core of it all. And what he says is that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, and then these other appearances. This is the core of the gospel. And so anything else that we might think of when we think of what is the gospel, it needs to look like this. This is what Paul says was of first importance, what he gave to people. And I want to key in on what we said about verse 3. I delivered to you, or I handed down to you what I also received. So Paul didn't make this up, or I think Andrew said editorialize it. This is what Paul was taught when he believed the gospel. And so this goes back even before Paul. So this then is Paul communicating what is central to the gospel, what the earliest disciples were preaching, and this is what Paul himself had also been taught as the foundation of the gospel after his conversion experience. Do you notice anything, number 2, do you notice anything interesting about the way, in particular, verses 3 through 5 are written? Is there anything interesting about the way verses 3 through 5 are written? How about look for some repetition? Is there anything repeated?
that he.
Okay, and what else?
Repetition of for our and
Yeah, so there's this, that he, obviously all centering on Christ, but he says, Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. That he was buried and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. Now, why would you, if you're communicating something, why would you repeat certain things like that? Emphasis, and if you repeat for emphasis, what does that make it easier to do? To remember it. So for one thing, realize that they were oral cultures. They didn't have, the codex, the book wasn't invented for a while even after this. So this was stated in such a way that they would be able to remember it. They could take away the core truths of the gospel and remember what he said. And so you see kind of this repetition here. And Paul is repeating something that he had previously taught, and that was apparently taught by others before that, because it's what he had received, what was handed to him. And it's written in this formulaic way of I keep losing my place on this page. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And so it's written in this formulaic way, probably for memorization. And with all of that in mind, that this is something that Paul had received himself and then he handed over to other people, and that it's something that is memorizable, if that's a word. It's often suggested that this was a nugget of the earliest Christian teaching, which is sometimes called a creed. And I know there's a reaction against that word. But what creed means here is it's just a formal statement of belief. And so this was a formal statement of belief that the early Christians were repeating and memorizing as the heart of the gospel. So we're starting now to see, hopefully, why this is important. This is something that goes back to even before Paul, that the disciples were repeating and memorizing. This is where the foundation of the gospel was. It was a definite expression of Christian belief at the earliest times. And so I mentioned a little bit of that paragraph in the middle of page 5. So we say explicitly that this is commonly thought to be a formal statement of belief that Paul learned after becoming a disciple, and that he passed to others like the Corinthians. And it has to do with both how it's structured, that's repetitive, and then the details, some of which, that he appeared to Cephas, then he appeared to James, by talking to those individuals. And so we can tell based on what Paul writes here that this was some of the earliest teaching that the Christians were spreading around. And what that was is that Christ died for our sins, that he was buried and raised on the third day, and that all that was in accordance with the scriptures, and then that he appeared to different witnesses. And so that is important in and of itself, and we see that this goes way back, but we're going to go even further because I think we can see even more how important this is. And so we're not saying, in what I'm saying here, we're not saying that Paul learned the gospel from other people. He's very clear, for instance, in Galatians, he got the gospel from Jesus himself. But it's also clear from Galatians that he went and talked to the other apostles. And so he learned the core gospel from Jesus, but then some of these things that he received or that was delivered to him, meaning like the traditions or when Jesus appeared to who, those kind of things, I think he got from those people in some of these times when he was visiting them. And so we talk about, I know Galatians chapter 1, 18 through 19. Let's turn there for a second. So one thing that Paul's doing here in the first couple chapters of Galatians, he's arguing for the authenticity of what he preached to the Galatians, that, I'm not peddling anything. This is not something that I came up with on my own. He says in verse 11 of Galatians 1, I would have you know that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel, I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. So that's not what we're saying Paul received here. What we're saying Paul received was the traditions and some of that, memorized material, and talking to Peter about Jesus appearing to him, and talking to James about the fact that he appeared to him. And you see some of how Paul constructed this. And so I want you to look at, up here at the screen real quick, about 1 Corinthians 15. And what is usually thought is that verses 3 through 5 is that what Paul would have originally received as part of the tradition. We already said that's what's repetitious. That's the part that's easily memorizable. And then he adds on what we see in instance verses 6 through 8. Then he appeared to more than 500. Then he appeared to James. And last of all, he appeared to me. And you can see how that kind of breaks that pattern of how verses 3 through 5 is structured. He's not repeating things. It's not rhyming, that sort of thing. But this is also core material that he adds and that he learned. Okay. So looking then at Galatians 1. Can someone read Galatians 1, 15 through 19? Ashley.
I'm reading from the NET. But when the one who set me apart from birth and called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I could preach him among the Gentiles, I did not go to ask advice from any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before me, but right away I departed to Arabia and then returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and get information from him, and I stayed with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother.
Okay, thank you. So this is important. So again, Paul is saying, I didn't come up with this stuff all on my own. I received it from Jesus. And he talks about this fact that he didn't talk with any of the apostles at first. But then later he goes to, for instance, visit Peter. And he says, I didn't talk to anyone else except Peter and James. Because he's still proving, this is not from anybody else. I'm preaching you God's gospel. And actually, so what I have in front of me, the ESV says in verse 18, then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas. And what did your verse 18 say, Ashley?
To visit Cephas.
And then at the end of the verse.
And get information from him.
Okay. So a lot of us have this visit here, and the full kind of idea of it is what Ashley read, to visit and get information from. And you can look at this later. But Paul wasn't just paying a visit, and as some people say, they didn't spend the whole time talking about the weather. There was a reason he went, and he talks about later, to see if I had been running in vain, to compare what I was teaching with what they were teaching. And so they're not just sitting here hanging out. There was a reason that Paul went here. And so we can't prove this, but I want to suggest times like this, maybe even this time, that Paul goes and visits Peter, is when he would have received these traditions. He's going back to the heart of the movement. He learns some of the traditions. He talks to Peter and learns, okay, so Jesus appeared to Peter. He gets it from his own mouth. He talks to James, and Jesus appeared to James, and he gets it from his own mouth. And this is really, I think, more of the idea of what Paul is receiving in verse 3 of 1 Corinthians 15. I'm telling you all of the same stuff that was taught to me. He didn't learn the gospel from them, but he learns this traditional material then that he repeats. Does that distinction make sense? We understand what we're talking about so far? Okay, like I said, there's a little bit of complicated material in here, and if you're not understanding, it's not you, it's probably my communication here. I want to make sure that we get this. Okay, so I want to talk for a minute about why we're discussing this. And you're going to have to sit here for a minute and just stick with me. Because I'm going to say some things and you're going to think, where is he going with this? So in the in the world of biblical studies in theology, there's always new, different ideas coming along, right? That's how you get published, is you come up with something new and revolutionary. So one idea that's been around for a long time is that some of the writings we have in the New Testament were not actually written by Paul. Stick with me, like I said. And we're talking just the very broad spectrum of biblical studies. So this includes people who do not even believe in God, but still study this professionally. And they say, well, Paul didn't actually write all of these. However, essentially everyone over the last 200 years or so of what we might call modern biblical scholarship agrees on a certain collection of letters that Paul definitely did write. And that includes Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, and then sometimes Philemon. And if you think about that, that's because they all have a biographical material about Paul in them. I mean, that's one of them. Again, keep in mind that this is across the whole spectrum. I'm not suggesting that there's weight to it. We're talking about a minimal facts of what everybody is going to agree on. And so nobody disputes that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 15. Everyone across the board has always agreed that. And so that's one of the reasons that we're looking at this, is that nobody can say, well, that wasn't actually written by one of the apostles, because nobody has seriously believed that or proved that. So that's part of what we're talking about. But even further, so everyone believes that Paul actually wrote this, and it's usually thought that this 1 Corinthians was one of his earlier letters that he wrote. You know, if you trace out the whole thing through Acts of where Paul was and when he's writing what, and that's an interesting exercise. But it's usually thought that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians around about the year 55 AD. And I have this in the notes here, and yeah, you can follow along with what I'm saying kind of in summary on page 5. It's usually said that Paul wrote this around 55 AD. And you can look in Acts chapter 18, and that's the recording of when he goes to Corinth, and there's all kinds of fun stuff that happens when they're there, riots and different things. And it says in chapter 18 and verse 11 that he stayed there over a year and 6 months. And it's usually agreed on that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians at 55, but that he actually went to Corinth at 50. Again, I said there's complications. We got to stick with a lot of numbers and things. He writes 1 Corinthians in the year 55, and that was after he had been there in the year 50. Now, the year 50 is about 15 to 20 years after Jesus died. So that's pretty early. So even from this point, we can see if this is something that Paul already had, and then he gives to the Corinthians in the year 50, this is a traditional material that would have had to be developed within that 15 to 20 years after Jesus died. Meaning this is extremely early teaching. We can't say, oh, this is some kind of legendary thing that was developed later by later people in the 2nd century or something like this. This is what the earliest Christians were teaching each other and memorizing and preaching. But we can go even farther than that. We see that Paul told them in about 55 that this is what I also received. And so this is what Paul also was taught before he was even teaching it. And like we said, that's not to say that Paul learned the gospel from other people. He received it from Jesus. He was an apostle. But again, these traditions and some of the memorizing, there's another word and I can't come up with it. The memorizable material, whatever it is, the traditional material, is what he probably learns from them. And so what Paul most likely did learn were some of the surrounding historical facts about Jesus. What did Jesus say while he was alive? Well, go talk to Peter and go talk to James. What was it like when he appeared to you? And Paul says in some of his other letters, he goes and he investigates all of these things. He learns the gospel from Jesus, but then he kind of understands the rest of the story from the church at large. And so then when did Paul receive this? is what we're going to talk about here. And so this is getting kind of toward the end of page 5. It's usually said that Paul encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus somewhere between the year 31 and 36. And that depends on when we're dating the crucifixion. And there's usually 2 possible dates given for that. But sometime between 31 and 36 is when Paul is converted. So if Paul received these traditions, they would have had to have been constructed before he became a disciple, right? If he learns them from other people as part of the teaching, they would have been developed before he was a disciple. And he became a disciple of Jesus and received those sometime in the mid-30s, mid to late 30s. 36 is, I would say, still mid-30s. This means that the material in 1 Corinthians 15 here that we're talking about must have been composed sometime before the mid to late 30s. And if you know anything about history, then the hairs on your arm should stand up. Okay. So I want to read this quote that I have on page 5 here, the one with the line next to it. And this is, for one, to show you, this is not just Ethan crazy talking and saying something we don't understand. And so this is a New Testament academic here saying this. Scholars are unanimous that this tradition, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5, originated at the latest within a decade of Jesus' death, and at the earliest months after Jesus' death. At the latest, a decade. This is literally perhaps the earliest gospel teaching that is in the New Testament, right here in 1 Corinthians 15. And you got to do some historical digging to kind of see that, but essentially everyone across the board, whether they even believe in Jesus or not, says, yeah, this was developed sometime probably within 10 years, maybe even months after Jesus was executed. Meaning, again, this is the earliest core gospel that the apostles were believing and teaching and preaching throughout the world. This is not some kind of later development. This is not something that somebody came up with later. Again, this is the bedrock, the minimum facts of Christianity. I want to read that bolded paragraph that I have at the bottom of 5. And then I'm going to ask if anybody is totally confused, and we can talk about this. So this core material about the gospel, which Paul gave to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, was developed less than 10 years after the events of Jesus' death and resurrection, making it possibly the earliest record of the core gospel teaching in the New Testament, and therefore very historically valuable. From the beginning, the earliest witnesses were teaching that Jesus died, was raised, and was afterwards seen alive by many people. And that's what we have here in 1 Corinthians 15. And why we're going to such pains to establish that will become a little clearer at the end of the class, or toward the latter part of the class. Because one of the most common objections to Christianity today is, yeah, Jesus was a real guy, but the disciples took what happened and they embellished it and basically created a legend. And that's not possible when this material is developed months to 10 years after Jesus' death and resurrection.
I didn't get that. I read the material and I read the verses, but I don't know how you got that.
The years?
Yes.
Part of that is, it's a lot of historical kind of back and forth, and I'm trying to summarize the information here. And so there's a lot more information, and I'm also not a professional historian, so I can't communicate all of it the most clearly. But essentially it is, Paul gave this to the Corinthians at a certain time. So if he was giving it to them, it was written before then. And if Paul himself received it, then it was written before Paul was teaching it. And when you kind of keep taking those steps back, you look and say, okay, this is when it was constructed or developed as a teaching that was being put forward to the disciples to memorize or to remember. And that's really all we need to remember here, is that this is something that goes back before the Corinthians, before Paul, to the earliest teaching that the apostles were putting forth and proclaiming. Does that part make sense? Not really? Okay.
I'm kind of lost. I don't, I hear what you're saying, but it's still, I don't know how you come across that. I mean, Paul teaches them what he had received, and yet, I don't know how he got to the 10 years after the event.
Well, part of that is knowing when the letter's written, when Paul visited there, and you're kind of using those years as benchmarks, and then taking steps back and say, okay, we know it was written then, we know Paul visited then, and so it had to have been constructed before then. And so you're taking those years that we can know, and you're just kind of stepping back and using that basically to trace the dots.
So because of Paul, when he received saw Christ on the road to Damascus and the resurrection and all that, then is that where you're getting this idea of the 10 years?
Yeah, so Paul is converted. He encounters Jesus about, roughly the year 35-ish. And so for this then to have been taught to Paul after that fact, we're saying that probably means that it was written before Paul became a Christian. And that's really what it is. So it's even before Paul, this is what the apostles were teaching before Paul became a Christian in, roughly 35. Bryce, you were going to say something.
The only thing I was going to say was the reason this is valuable is because the closer we can get to an eyewitness, the better we are at least producing a credible story. And so there are a lot of people who are not Christians who will recognize the fact of when this was written, that it was written by Paul. We can trace back through biblical example and maybe somewhat through other outside sources as well, when likely he was converted. And so the closer we can get to the date that this all began, the more valuable is the source.
Right.
And so, I mean, just like with some significant event in our own day, the closer we can get to having an eyewitness, the better the source.
Right.
And so that's the significance for us, is that and really not just for us, but perhaps for somebody outside too, who is willing to accept these bedrock facts that are established by a lot of people who are not necessarily sympathetic to the way. And so it could be significant for other people too, who are willing to investigate the evidence.
Yeah. And so like Bryce said, we're getting back as close as possible to the eyewitnesses, and we're doing it in such a way to look at it to where you do not even have to be a Christian to believe this. We're saying that this is what anybody who has any clue what they're talking about agrees upon. And some of that is we're taking a neutral position and saying, okay, regardless of if someone believes in the Bible even, what are we all able to agree on? And what everybody is able to agree on is this is as close you can get to an eyewitness account. So I got Andrew and then Ashley.
Yeah, so I didn't really follow this the first time I read it through in the material, but hearing it spoken out, I think I do now. And the key distinction that I wasn't making before was this distinction that Paul wasn't the first Christian.
Right.
And it's such a short read from the end of the Gospels to the point in Acts when Paul's converted that we often lose sight that Christians were operating before Paul was in the picture.
For years, yeah.
Christianity was active before Paul was in the picture.
Yeah. So he learns all of those traditions and everything that goes on. I want to give you one more example so you can see maybe another angle of this. And this will be the last thing that we talk about. Go to 1 Corinthians 11. So 1 Corinthians 11, we're going to jump down to verse 23. And so what we're about to show is that in 1 Corinthians we have a few instances where Paul says, I taught you the same thing that I was taught. So 1 Corinthians 11:23, for I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you. He received this directly from Jesus. That the Lord Jesus on the night when he was betrayed took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body. And so this is another instance where Paul says, I taught you the same things that I was taught. And there's another one in chapter 7 and different things like that. And I think another thing that we need to say, and this will really be the last thing, is that the epistles were written before the Gospels for the most part. The epistles were written before the Gospels. And so the epistles are earlier historical documents than the Gospels are. And so we're trying to put our historian hats on and say, let's get as close to the source as possible. And it seems backward to say that the earliest source material about Jesus is not actually in the Gospels. It's in the letters of Paul, because Paul wrote his letters first. And so that's another, I think, connection maybe that has to be made. And again, this is me trying to take complicated material and summarize it in a page. And so as long as we get the center of it and we don't necessarily understand all the details, that's what's important. And if you have questions about this, I'm happy to talk about it. And I would encourage you, if you look at page 6, to go back and try to answer that number 1 on page 6 again. So after we've talked about this, then try to answer number 1 again to see if you can kind of rehearse and review what we've talked about. And I think that'll be a beneficial exercise. Okay, so next class, we will start the new packet. Maybe wrap up any last minute questions that anyone has, and we're going to start talking about the core facts of the gospel. The first one being that Jesus was a real person.